Tom Mitchell pressed his weathered forehead against the cold airplane window, watching Chicago's skyline shrink beneath him like a child's toy set. His reflection stared back, deep-set brown eyes framed by crow's feet, a face carved by 37 years of Nebraska sun and wind, silver hair still showing traces of the dark brown it used to be. At 58, Tom looked exactly like what he was, a man who wrestled with soil and machinery for a living. First time flying. The voice belonged to a young woman in the adjacent seat, 14B, her designer handbag screaming money in a way Tom's scuffed Carhartt jacket never would. Tom smiled, the kind of gentle, knowing smile that comes from a lifetime of patience. "No, ma'am. Done it a few times. Just never gets old seeing the world from up here." His voice carried the slow, deliberate cadence of rural America, every word measured, nothing wasted. The woman nodded politely and returned to her phone. Tom didn't mind. He preferred the solitude anyway. His calloused hands that could rebuild a transmission or deliver a calf with equal skill, carefully smoothed open a well-worn copy of Aviation Week and Space Technology. The pages were dog-eared, margins filled with his penciled notes and questions. United Express Flight 3411 had departed Chicago O'Hare at 2:47 p.m. on October 15, 2019, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The Embraer ERJ-175 aircraft hummed with the familiar sounds of modern air travel, the whisper of recycled air through vents, the muffled conversations of 64 passengers settling in, the distant clatter of beverage carts being prepared in the galley. Tom had spent the weekend in Chicago visiting his daughter, Rebecca, watching his 3-year-old grandson take his first wobbly bike ride. The memory made him smile. Rebecca had inherited her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn determination. She'd built a good life in the city, so different from the endless cornfields Tom called home. In seat 7C, a businessman typed furiously on his laptop, racing against some deadline that would be forgotten within a week. 3 rows back, an elderly couple held hands, their wedding rings worn smooth by 53 years of marriage. A college student with purple hair listened to music, head bobbing. A mother tried to soothe a fussy infant. All of them beautifully, blissfully unaware that in approximately 17 minutes their lives would hang by a thread. In the cockpit, Captain Sarah Chen ran through her post-takeoff checklist with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this exact routine 8,247 times before. At 42, she was one of the airline's most experienced pilots, a career that began in the Air Force, flying C-130 transport planes over Afghanistan. Her short black hair was tucked neatly under her cap, her dark eyes scanning instruments with the focus of a surgeon. "Clean climb, smooth air ahead," First Officer Marcus Webb reported, his fingers dancing across the touchscreen displays. At 31, Webb was younger, newer to commercial aviation, but sharp as a tack. His military bearing, straight back, clipped speech revealed his own background as a Navy pilot. He'd flown FA-18 Hornets off aircraft carriers before transitioning to the calmer world of regional airlines. "Looking good, Marcus," Chen replied, her voice carrying that particular confidence that comes from 10,000 hours in the sky. "Let's level off at 18,000, then wheel." Back in the cabin, Tom had reached page 47 of his magazine, an article about hydraulic system redundancies in modern aircraft. His reading wasn't casual browsing. It was study, the kind of focused attention he'd once given to 4-H manuals as a teenager, learning everything about farming before he could legally drive. The dream of flying had lived in Tom Mitchell's chest since he was 7 years old, watching crop dusters swoop over his father's fields like mechanical birds. He'd applied to flight school after high school, but life had other plans. His father's heart attack, the farm that needed running, a young wife pregnant with their first child, dreams deferred, then buried under decades of responsibility. But the dream never quite died. It hibernated through harvest seasons and brutal winters, through his wife Martha's cancer scare and his son's deployment to Iraq. Now, with the farm stable and his kids grown, Tom had finally enrolled in ground school for his private pilot's license. Every spare moment he studied aviation theory, navigation, and his favorite aircraft systems and mechanics. Because Tom Mitchell understood machines in his bones, he could diagnose a failing water pump by sound alone. He could feel a tractor's transmission starting to grind weeks before it actually failed. His neighbors joked that he could have a conversation with a combine harvester. Tom would laugh and shrug, but there was truth in it. Machines spoke a language, and he'd spent a lifetime learning to listen. The October sun blazed through the cabin windows, painting everything in warm amber light. Outside, Lake Michigan sparkled like scattered diamonds. The plane climbed steadily, powerfully, a marvel of engineering carrying its human cargo through the sky at 320 miles per hour. Tom's fingers traced a hydraulic system diagram in his magazine, 3 independent systems, all with backups, all designed so failure was virtually impossible. Modern aircraft were miracles of redundancy. What could go wrong? Flight attendant Jennifer Costa moved down the aisle with practiced grace, her smile professional but genuine. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Tom glanced up. "Just water, thanks." "Coming right up." She moved on, her mind already running through the beverage service routine she'd performed thousands of times. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers relaxed, unbuckled, stretched. The businessman ordered scotch. The college student asked for the whole can of Coke. Everything normal, everything routine. Tom returned to his magazine, but his attention drifted. Through the window, he could see the wing, that beautiful, curved structure that defied gravity through nothing but physics and human ingenuity. He watched the slight movements of the flaps, the way sunlight gleamed off polished metal. Then he heard it. So faint that nobody else noticed. A sound barely louder than a whisper, buried under the engine noise and cabin chatter. But Tom's ears trained by decades of listening to failing equipment, caught it instantly. A whine high-pitched, irregular. His body went still. That sound, he knew that sound. Tom's eyes fixed on the wing, on the hydraulic actuators controlling the flaps. Something was wrong. The magazine slipped from his hands and fell to the floor, forgotten. And then, at exactly 3:04 p.m., at 18,000 feet above rural Illinois, Captain Sarah Chen saw the first warning light flicker to life on her instrument panel. The nightmare was beginning. The first warning light was small, almost innocent. An amber glow labeled HYD1 Press on Captain Sarah Chen's instrument panel. She glanced at it with the mild concern of someone who'd seen thousands of caution lights, most of them false alarms or minor glitches that corrected themselves. "Marcus, you seeing this?" Her voice was calm, professional. First Officer Webb's eyes flicked to the hydraulic system display. "Yeah, pressure's dropping on System 1, probably just a sensor." He never finished the sentence. The cockpit exploded in sound. Beep, 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 beep. Red lights blazed across the panel like a Christmas tree designed in hell. The master warning alarm, a sound both pilots had only heard in simulators, shrieked with mechanical urgency. HYD1 failure. Webb's voice jumped an octave. His hands flew across the touchscreen, pulling up system diagnostics. Pressure 0, complete loss. Chen's training kicked in like muscle memory. Her hands moved with practiced precision, working through the emergency checklist burned into her brain by thousands of hours in simulators. Switching to hydraulic system 2, confirming backup. The second alarm screamed before she could finish. BWOP, BWOP, BWOP. No, Webb's shout was pure disbelief. System 2 pressure dropping. Sarah, we're losing too. Chen's blood turned to ice water. Her eyes locked on the instrument panel where impossible numbers scrolled past. Hydraulic System 1, 0 psi. Hydraulic System 2, 200 psi and falling fast. Hydraulic System 3, 900 psi normal, but for how long? This doesn't happen. Can't happen. Modern aircraft had triple redundancy. 3 completely independent hydraulic systems. The probability of losing even 2 systems simultaneously was calculated in the millions to 1. It was the kind of failure that showed up in accident investigation reports, not in real flights. Chicago Center, United 3411, declaring an emergency. Webb's hand shook as he keyed the radio. We have dual hydraulic failure, requesting immediate vectors back to O'Hare. The radio crackled. United 3411, say again, confirm dual hydraulic failure. Affirmative, systems 1 and 2 are gone. We need priority handling now. In the cabin, the change was subtle at first. A slight shudder, like driving over railroad tracks. Passengers glanced up from phones and magazines, momentary curiosity crossing their faces before they returned to their distractions. But Tom Mitchell didn't look away. His farmer's instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle language of dying machinery, screamed warnings. The whine he'd heard was louder now, accompanied by a grinding vibration he could feel through the seat frame. His eyes tracked the wing's surface. The flaps weren't moving right. The slight adjustments that should happen constantly, the tiny corrections that kept the plane stable, they were sluggish, delayed. The businessman in 7C finally noticed. Is it just me, or are we? The plane lurched left, a sickening sideways motion that sent his laptop sliding across his tray table. Gasps rippled through the cabin. In the cockpit, Captain Chen gripped the control yoke with both hands. It felt wrong, mushy, like steering a car with the power steering fluid drained out. She pulled back gently. The plane's nose should rise smoothly. Instead, there was a delay, then a sluggish, reluctant response. System 3 pressure at 700, Webb reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. Still falling. That's impossible. Chen's mind raced through scenarios, through every emergency procedure she'd ever learned. 3 independent systems don't fail together. They're completely separate, different pumps, different reservoirs, different routing. BWOP, BWOP, BWOP. System 3 at 500, we're losing them all. The mathematics of their situation hit Chen like a physical blow. No hydraulics meant no flight control surfaces, no ailerons to bank, no elevator to climb or descend, no rudder to turn. The only thing they'd have left was engine thrust, speeding up or slowing down. Everything else would be dead weight. She'd studied this scenario. United Flight 232, 1989, Sioux City, Iowa. Complete hydraulic failure. The crew had used differential engine thrust to control the aircraft, barely. They'd crashed anyway. 111 people dead. The intercom button felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Chen. She fought to keep her voice steady, professional, betraying nothing of the terror clawing at her chest. We're experiencing a technical issue with one of our systems. As a precaution, we're returning to Chicago. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and follow all instructions from the flight attendants. The cabin erupted in nervous murmurs. The young woman next to Tom grabbed her armrest, knuckles white. What kind of technical issue? Tom didn't answer. His eyes were closed, his mind racing through a database of mechanical failures he'd encountered over nearly 4 decades. Hydraulic systems. He'd worked with them his entire life. Tractors, combines, balers, industrial irrigation systems. The principles were the same whether you were controlling a harvester blade or an aircraft wing. Complete failure was rare. Usually it was a leak, a broken seal, a failed pump, but 3 systems failing together, that suggested something else. Something catastrophic affecting all 3 systems simultaneously. Or... His eyes snapped open. Not complete failure. The sound was wrong for that. When hydraulic systems died completely, there was silence, sudden, absolute absence of the working fluid. But that whine, that grinding vibration, those were sounds of a system trying to work but choking on something. Air, it had to be air in the lines. In the cockpit, Webb's voice cracked. System 3 at 300 psi. Sarah, at this rate we have maybe, he checked his watch, did rapid mental math, 12 minutes before we lose all pressure completely. Chen's hands trembled on the yoke. She could barely feel the aircraft responding anymore. The altimeter showed 17,200 feet. They were losing altitude, drifting down like a falling leaf. O'Hare was 70 miles away. Too far. They'd never make it. Start looking for somewhere to put down, she said quietly. Farmland, highway, anything flat. Webb pulled up the terrain map on his display. Below them, rural Illinois sprawled in a patchwork of fields, forests, and small towns. His finger traced possible landing sites, but they all looked impossibly small, impossibly dangerous. Sarah, his voice was barely a whisper. Even if we find a spot, we can't control our descent without hydraulics. We can't flare for landing. We'll hit at. He couldn't finish the calculation. Didn't need to, they both knew. Captain Sarah Chen stared at the instrument panel, at the 3 hydraulic pressure gauges, all showing numbers dropping toward 0, and felt the weight of 64 lives pressing down on her shoulders. Her lips moved, barely audible over the alarm bells. We're already dead. The cockpit voice recorder captured every word. In the cabin, oxygen masks suddenly dropped from overhead compartments with a collective thump that sent passengers into immediate panic. Screams pierced the air. A child began crying. The businessman fumbled with his phone, hands shaking, typing out a text message to his wife. Flight attendant Jennifer Costa grabbed the PA handset, her training overriding her terror. Passengers, place the masks over your nose and mouth. Pull the strap to tighten. Breathe normally. Assume the brace position when instructed. The plane lurched violently right. Tom Mitchell's water bottle flew from his tray table, bouncing off the ceiling. Around him, people were crying, praying, screaming. The college students' music blared from fallen headphones. The elderly couple clutched each other, the husband whispering something into his wife's ear. But Tom's mind was crystallizing, focusing with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of solving impossible mechanical problems under pressure. That sound, that specific grinding whine. He'd heard it before, last summer. His John Deere S780 combine harvester, middle of wheat season. The header hydraulics had failed or seemed to. Same whine, same grinding. The dealer said it was catastrophic, would take weeks to fix. Tom had fixed it in 4 hours. Air lock. The hydraulic lines had sucked in air during a fluid change. The air compressed under pressure, creating bubbles that blocked fluid flow. The system wasn't dead, it was choking. His heart pounded. It was insane. Impossible. The chances that a commercial aircraft was experiencing the same problem as his farm equipment were astronomical. But that sound. Tom unbuckled his seatbelt. The woman next to him grabbed his arm. "What are you doing? We're crashing." "Maybe not," Tom said quietly. He stood, gripping the seat backs as the plane shuddered and dropped. Around him, people stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Jennifer Costa saw him moving and rushed down the aisle. "Sir, return to your seat immediately." Tom Mitchell looked at her with the calm of a man who'd spent his life gambling against impossible odds. Weather, markets, equipment failures that could bankrupt a family. "Ma'am," he said in that slow, deliberate Nebraska drawl, "I need to talk to your pilots, right now, because I think I know what's wrong with this airplane." Cockpit of United Express Flight 3411 had transformed from a cathedral of modern technology into a screaming nightmare of failing systems. Captain Sarah Chen's hands gripped the control yoke so tightly her knuckles had gone bone white, tendons standing out like steel cables under her skin. System 3 at 100 psi. First Officer Marcus Webb's voice had lost all pretense of calm. Raw fear bled through every syllable. "Sarah, we're down to 15% capacity." Chen pulled back on the yoke, a motion that should make the nose rise smoothly. Nothing happened. She pulled harder. The aircraft's nose lifted maybe half a degree, then sagged back down like an exhausted animal. It was like trying to steer a car through mud with flat tires and no power steering. "Come on, come on, come on," she snarled at the machine, at physics itself. The altimeter spun downward with terrible consistency. 16,800 feet, 16,600, 16,400. They were falling at nearly 800 feet per minute, not a dive, but an uncontrolled descent that would smear them across Illinois farmland in less than 20 minutes. Webb's fingers flew across his touchscreen display, pulling up every emergency procedure in the aircraft's computer database. Dual hydraulic failure, triple hydraulic failure. Each checklist ended the same way: land as soon as possible. As if they had a choice. "Try the manual reversion," Chen barked. Webb's hands moved to a panel of mechanical backups, systems designed for this exact nightmare scenario. He pulled the manual gear extension handle. Usually, this would lower the landing gear using gravity and mechanical cables, bypassing hydraulics entirely. The gear indicator light stayed dark. "Negative on manual extension," Webb's voice cracked. "The gear doors need hydraulic pressure to open. We can't even get the wheels down." The mathematics of their situation was brutally simple. Without landing gear, they'd belly land on the aircraft's fuselage. Without hydraulic pressure, they couldn't control their descent angle. They'd hit the ground at whatever speed and attitude the plane happened to be in when they ran out of altitude. The result would be the same either way: a smoking crater and 64 body bags. "Chicago Center, United 3411, Webb transmitted, and Chen heard the tremor he was fighting to suppress. "We are unable to maintain altitude, unable to control flight path. We need every emergency asset you have. Fire, rescue, medical, everything." The air traffic controller's voice came back, professionally calm but urgent. "United 3411, understand you need emergency services. Be advised, O'Hare is 72 miles northeast of your position. Can you make the distance?" Chen and Webb exchanged a look. They both knew the answer. "Negative," Chen said quietly. "We won't make it. Start looking for options within 20 miles. 20 miles. At their current ground speed and descent rate, they had maybe 15 minutes. 15 minutes to live." Chen's mind raced through everything she'd ever learned, every emergency procedure, every accident investigation report she'd studied. United 232, Sioux City. They'd used differential engine thrust to control the aircraft. They'd made it to the airport, but they'd also crashed, cartwheeled down the runway, and killed 111 people. "Try differential thrust," she said. "If we can't use the flight controls, maybe we can steer with the engines." Webb's hands moved to the thrust levers. He advanced the right engine to maximum power while pulling the left engine back to idle. In theory, the uneven thrust would make the aircraft turn left. The plane shuddered, vibrated. The turn coordinator showed they were banking, but only 2 degrees, not enough. Not nearly enough to navigate to a landing site. Chen advanced both engines together. The aircraft's nose rose slightly. Their descent rate decreased from 800 feet per minute to 600. But they were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, and even this slight control required perfect coordination. "This isn't enough," Webb said, stating the obvious truth neither wanted to acknowledge. "We can barely control our heading. We can't descend at a controlled rate. We can't deploy flaps for slow flight. We can't lower the gear. Sarah, even if we find a perfect landing spot, we're going to hit at 200 knots or more." 200 knots. That was 230 miles per hour. The aircraft's fuselage wasn't designed to survive that kind of impact without landing gear. The wings would shear off. The fuel tanks would rupture. Fire would consume everything. Captain Sarah Chen was 42 years old. She'd flown combat missions over Afghanistan. She'd landed in crosswinds that would have grounded lesser pilots. She'd handled engine failures, electrical failures, bird strikes, and violent thunderstorms. She'd always found a way. But this... The words came out before she could stop them. "We're already dead." The cockpit voice recorder's digital memory captured the phrase perfectly, stamping it with a timestamp. 15:09:37 UTC. Webb's head snapped toward her. "Don't say that." "It's the truth." Chen's voice was hollow, empty of hope. "We're flying a machine we can't control, trying to land on gear we can't deploy, at a speed that will kill everyone on impact. Marcus, we need to face reality." "The reality is we still have altitude and we're still flying." Webb shot back, anger flashing in his eyes. "We don't give up." "I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic." Chen's composure cracked. Tears blurred her vision. "I have a daughter, Marcus. She's 7 years old. I promised her I'd take her to Disneyland next month. And I'm going to die 70 miles from Chicago because every goddamn hydraulic system on this aircraft decided to fail at the same time." The instrument panel blurred. Chen blinked hard, forcing the tears back. Crying wouldn't help. Emotions wouldn't help. Nothing would help. 14,200 feet. Through the cockpit windscreen, she could see the ground in terrible detail now. Farm fields arranged in neat squares. A ribbon of highway cutting through the landscape. A small town with a water tower glinting in the October sun. Somewhere down there, people were living their normal lives, completely unaware that 64 souls were about to rain down on them in a fireball. "Sarah," Webb's voice was quiet now, gentle. "My wife is pregnant, 3 months. We haven't told anyone yet. We were waiting until the second trimester." They looked at each other. Two people who'd been strangers 3 hours ago, now bound together in the most intimate experience possible, facing death together. "I'm sorry," Chen whispered. "Me too." The radio crackled. "United 3411, we have emergency crews staging at Rockford International, 43 miles northwest. Can you make it there?" 43 miles. Chen did the mental calculation. At their current descent rate and ground speed, maybe, just maybe. "We'll try," she transmitted back. But both pilots knew the truth. Even if they reached Rockford, even if they lined up perfectly with the runway, they had no way to slow down, no way to control their descent angle, no way to land safely. They would arrive at Rockford. And they would die at Rockford. 13,100 feet. Behind them, through the armored cockpit door, they could hear the chaos in the cabin. Screaming, crying, praying. 64 people who'd boarded a routine flight expecting nothing more dramatic than stale pretzels and recycled air. 64 people who trusted these two pilots to deliver them safely. 64 people whose trust was about to be betrayed by failing machinery. Chen's hand moved to the intercom button. She had to tell them something, had to prepare them. But what could she say? Brace for impact seemed inadequate when the impact would be catastrophic. Her finger hovered over the button. And then, impossibly, the cockpit phone rang. Both pilots stared at it. The cockpit phone was for communication with the flight attendants. In an emergency like this, with oxygen masks deployed and the cabin in chaos, Jennifer Costa should be strapped into her jumpseat, not making phone calls. Chen grabbed the handset. "What?" "Captain, I have a passenger who says he needs to talk to you." Jennifer's voice was strained but steady. "He says he knows about hydraulics. He thinks he knows what's wrong." A passenger? Chen's exhausted mind couldn't process this. "Jennifer, we don't have time for." "He's a farmer. He's been working with hydraulic systems for almost 40 years. Captain, he heard something before the failures started. He says it's not a complete system failure." Chen almost laughed. The hysteria of it. A farmer. with equipment advice for a commercial aircraft, while they were literally falling out of the sky. But then she looked at the instrument panel, at the pressure gauges that showed impossibly low numbers but weren't quite at zero, at the erratic fluctuations that made no engineering sense. They had maybe 12 minutes of altitude left. 12 minutes until impact. What did they have to lose? "Send him up," Chen said. She released the intercom and looked at Webb. "A farmer thinks he can help us." Webb's laugh was bitter, edged with madness. "Perfect, absolutely perfect. We're going to die and our last hope is a farmer." The cockpit door unlocked with a click. And Thomas Mitchell, wearing mud-stained boots and a flannel shirt, stepped into the most technologically advanced piece of machinery he'd ever seen. The cockpit of a commercial airliner is designed for 2 people. Cramped, efficient, every inch of space optimized for the pilots and their instruments. When Tom Mitchell stepped through the reinforced door, the space seemed to shrink even further. Captain Sarah Chen whipped around in her seat, and for a split second her exhausted brain couldn't process what she was seeing. A man in his late 50s, weathered face, calloused hands, wearing work boots that had probably walked through more manure than airport terminals. His flannel shirt was faded, his jeans worn at the knees. He looked like he should be driving a tractor, not standing in the cockpit of a dying aircraft. "Who the hell are you?" Chen's voice was raw, frayed at the edges. "Tom Mitchell, ma'am, Nebraska farmer." His voice was steady, calm, unnaturally calm given that the aircraft was shuddering beneath them, alarms screaming, the altimeter unwinding toward oblivion. "I think I might be able to help." First Officer Marcus Webb's laugh was pure hysteria. "A farmer. Captain, we're at 12,000 feet with failing hydraulics and she brings us a farmer." Tom didn't flinch. He'd faced skepticism his entire life. Bankers who didn't think a kid from nowhere could run a successful farm. Suppliers who assumed he was stupid because of his accent. City folks who thought anyone who worked with dirt was beneath them. He'd learned long ago that the best response was simply to do the work. "I've been working with hydraulic systems since I was 15 years old," Tom said, his eyes already scanning the instrument panel. "Tractors, combines, irrigation systems, balers. If it uses hydraulic pressure, I've probably fixed it. And I heard something before your system started failing." "You heard something?" Webb's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Oh, perfect. Let me just check my manual for the section on things farmers heard." "Marcus," Chen snapped. Then to Tom, her voice tight with barely controlled desperation, "You have 30 seconds. Convince me you're not wasting what little time we have left." Tom pointed at the hydraulic pressure gauges. All 3 showed impossibly low numbers, but they weren't flat-lined at 0. System 1, fluctuating between 0 and 15 psi. System 2, wavering around 30 psi. System 3, dropping but still showing 85 psi. "That flutter," Tom said, his finger tracing the gauge needles as they trembled. "That's not a dying system, that's a choking system." Chen blinked. "What?" "When hydraulic systems fail completely, catastrophic pump failure, ruptured line, empty reservoir, the pressure drops to 0 and stays there. Dead flat. No fluctuation." Tom's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen this exact pattern hundreds of times. "But your gauges are dancing. That means fluid is trying to move through the system, but something's blocking it intermittently." Webb leaned forward, his skepticism wavering. "Blocking it? What could block all 3 independent systems simultaneously?" "Air," Tom said simply. "Air locks in the hydraulic lines." The cockpit went silent except for the screaming alarms. Chen's mind raced. Air in hydraulic systems. It was basic physics. Hydraulic fluid is incompressible, which is why it works for transmitting force. But air is compressible. Get air bubbles in the lines and the pressure squeezes the air instead of moving the pistons. The system chokes. But how could air get into all 3 systems at once? "That's impossible," Webb said. "These systems are sealed, pressurized. Air can't just get in there. Not under normal circumstances, Tom agreed. But what if you had a pressure spike, or a rapid decompression event, or some kind of maintenance error during servicing? He paused. I had the exact same thing happen to my combine harvester last summer, middle of wheat harvest. All the header hydraulics went crazy, pressure dropping, cylinders stuttering, exact same pattern as what I'm seeing on your gauges. And you fixed it. Chen's voice was suddenly sharp, focused. 4 hours. My dealer said it would take 2 weeks and cost $15,000. I cleared the air locks myself. Tom's eyes met hers. The principles are the same whether you're controlling a harvester blade or an aircraft wing. Hydraulic fluid is hydraulic fluid. Pressure is pressure. Physics doesn't care if you're in a cornfield or 30,000 feet up. 11,400 feet. The altimeter continued its relentless countdown. Chen felt something she hadn't felt in the last 10 minutes, a spark of hope. It was insane. Absolutely insane. Taking mechanical advice from a farmer while piloting a commercial aircraft. But she'd exhausted every procedure in the book. Every emergency checklist had led to the same conclusion: controlled crash landing, probable fatalities. What did they have to lose? How did you clear the air locks? She asked. Tom moved closer to the instrument panel, his farmer's eyes studying the hydraulic system schematics displayed on the touchscreen. Despite never having seen this exact setup before, he recognized the patterns. Pump, reservoir, control valves, actuator cylinders. The names were different, the scale was different, but the fundamental design was identical to every hydraulic system he'd ever worked on. You need to purge the air from the lines, he said, his finger tracing the schematic. But you can't do it the normal way. That requires external pumps and time we don't have. You need to use the system's own pressure to push the air through. How? Webb was leaning in now, his earlier skepticism replaced by desperate attention. You cycle the pumps in a specific sequence. Create pressure pulses that push the air bubbles through the system instead of letting them sit there blocking everything. Tom's mind was racing through the procedure he'd used on his combine. On my equipment, I had to override the automatic controls and manually pulse the auxiliary pump while manipulating the control valves in a specific pattern. Chen's hands hovered over the controls. What pattern? That's the thing, Tom said slowly. I don't know your exact system. On my combine, it was 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off, repeated while cycling through each control circuit. But your aircraft systems might be different. We'd have to experiment. Experiment, Webb's voice rose. We're falling out of the sky and you want to experiment. Tom turned to face him, and Webb saw something in those weathered eyes that made him pause. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't recklessness. It was the calm certainty of a man who'd spent his entire life making life-or-death decisions with million-dollar equipment and his family's livelihood on the line. Son, I've been gambling against impossible odds my whole life, Tom said quietly. Weather, markets, equipment that breaks at the worst possible moment. You learn to trust your gut and work the problem. Right now, you've got 2 choices. Do nothing and guarantee everyone dies, or try something unconventional and maybe, just maybe, live to tell the story. Chen looked at Webb. Webb looked at the altimeter, 10,800 feet, 9 minutes, maybe less. What do we need to do? Chen asked. Tom's face remained calm, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. He was about to attempt something that had never been done before, applying farm equipment repair techniques to a commercial aircraft in flight. If he was wrong, 64 people would die. But if he did nothing, 64 people would die anyway. First, I need you to show me your hydraulic system override controls, Tom said. And then I need you to trust me like you'd trust a surgeon in an operating room, because that's what this is, emergency surgery on a dying machine. Chen's hands moved across the touchscreen, pulling up the hydraulic system control panel. A maze of digital readouts, pump controls, valve positions, and override switches designed for ground maintenance. not in-flight operation. Here, she said, but I'm warning you, if we mess this up, we could lose what little pressure we have left. Tom studied the screen, his mind translating the modern digital interface into concepts he understood. Pump 1, Pump 2, Pump 3, auxiliary pump, reservoir levels, valve positions. It was like looking at a John Deere diagnostic computer translated into aircraft speak. "Okay," he said softly, "I can work with this." 10,200 feet. Outside the cockpit window, the ground was getting very, very close. Tom could make out individual houses now, cars on roads, the grid pattern of farm fields that looked so much like his own land back in Nebraska. Somewhere down there, his wife Martha was probably making dinner, completely unaware that her husband was about to attempt the most important repair of his life. "Let's start," Tom said, "and let's pray I remember how I fixed that damn combine." The decision Captain Sarah Chen was about to make violated every regulation, every protocol, every standard operating procedure drilled into her during 10,000 hours of flight time. Airlines didn't consult passengers on technical emergencies. Pilots didn't take mechanical advice from farmers. The FAA would crucify her if this went wrong. But regulations were written for normal situations, and there was nothing normal about falling from the sky with 3 failed hydraulic systems. "Do it," Chen said, her voice cutting through the cockpit alarms like a blade. "Tell us what you need." First Officer Marcus Webb's head snapped toward her. "Sarah, are you insane? We're going to let a passenger, a farmer, manipulate our aircraft systems." "We're dead anyway," Chen shot back. "Look at that altimeter, Marcus. Look at it. We have 8 minutes before we hit the ground. 8 minutes. Every procedure we know has failed. So yes, I'm going to listen to the man who actually thinks he can help instead of sitting here waiting to die." Webb's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Tom Mitchell standing there in his work boots and flannel shirt, then at the altimeter spinning downward past 10,000 feet, then back at his captain. "This is insane," he whispered, but he didn't argue further. Tom moved closer to the center console, his eyes locked on the hydraulic control panel. His hands that had rebuilt transmissions and delivered calves, that knew the feel of soil and the rhythm of machinery, hovered over controls worth millions of dollars. "First thing," Tom said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, "I need you to disengage the automatic hydraulic pressure regulation. We need manual control." Chen's fingers found the switch. "Done. We're in manual mode." "Good. Now, what's your auxiliary pump status?" Webb checked his screen. "Auxiliary pump is running, trying to maintain pressure. It's failing." "It's failing because it's fighting against the air locks," Tom explained, his mind visualizing the invisible battle happening inside the hydraulic lines. "The pump is trying to push fluid through, but the air bubbles compress instead of moving. We need to create pressure pulses, rapid cycles that will push the air through the system instead of just compressing it." "How?" Chen asked. Tom's finger pointed to the pump control. "We're going to cycle the auxiliary pump on and off in a specific rhythm. 3 seconds on, building pressure. 2 seconds off, letting it drop slightly. The cycling will create pressure waves that should push the air bubbles toward the bleed valves." "Should?" Webb's voice cracked. "You're not even certain." Tom turned to face him, and his voice carried the weight of 37 years of agricultural gambling. "Son, farming is educated guessing backed by experience. I plant seeds in April hopping for rain in May. I bet my family's future on commodity prices I can't control. I fix equipment that costs more than most houses using intuition and prayer. Am I certain? No, but I'm certain we die if we don't try." 9,400 feet. Chen's hand moved to the pump control. "Tell me exactly what to do." "Start the cycle. 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off. I'll count." Chen toggled the auxiliary pump. The gauge flickered. Pump engaged. Tom watched the pressure readings with the intensity of a surgeon monitoring a patient's vitals. 1, 2, 3, off. Chen killed the pump. 1, 2, on. The gauge jumped slightly, 20 psi on system 2, then dropped back to 15. Again, Tom said, keep the rhythm steady, 3 on, 2 off. They cycled, again. Nothing changed. Webb's voice was desperate. It's not working. Give it time, Tom insisted, though doubt was creeping into his own mind. The air needs to work through the system. On my combine it took. We don't have time, Webb shouted, pointing at the altimeter. 8,000 feet, we're running out of sky. Tom's jaw clenched. Think. What was different? On his combine, he'd also manipulated the control valves to help push the air through different circuits. The aircraft would have similar valve systems. Which hydraulic system controls your primary flight surfaces? Tom asked urgently. System 1 for ailerons, System 2 for elevators, System 3 for rudder, Chen responded automatically. We need to cycle the control valves while we pulse the pump. Open and close each circuit to help push the air through. Tom's hands gestured, sketching invisible hydraulic lines in the air. It's like priming an old water pump. You have to work the handle to get the air out. Chen's eyes widened. You want us to intentionally manipulate the flight control valves while we're barely maintaining altitude? Yes. That could destabilize what little control we have left. Or it could save everyone on this plane. Tom's voice rose for the first time, passion breaking through his calm exterior. Captain, I know this is crazy. I know it sounds impossible. But I've seen this work. Not on an airplane, but the physics are the same. Fluid dynamics don't change just because you're in the sky instead of a wheat field. 7,600 feet. Sarah Chen had seconds to make a decision that would either save 64 lives or kill them all slightly faster. She looked at the instrument panel, at the flickering pressure gauges that refused to stabilize. She looked at Marcus Webb, whose fear mirrored her own. She looked at Tom Mitchell, a man who had no business being in her cockpit, offering a solution that had no business working. And she thought about her 7-year-old daughter, who was expecting Mommy to come home tonight. Marcus, she said quietly, help him, we're doing this. Sarah. That's an order, First Officer. Webb's shoulders sagged in defeat or perhaps acceptance. Yes, Captain. Tom positioned himself between the two pilots, his eyes moving between the hydraulic schematic and the control inputs. Okay, here's what we do. Marcus, you'll manipulate the aileron controls, full left, hold, full right, hold, cycling back and forth. Sarah, you pulse the pump like before, 3 on, 2 off. I'll watch the pressure gauges and call out any changes. This is insane, Webb muttered, but his hands moved to the controls. On my count, Tom said. His heart hammered so hard he was sure they could hear it. Every eye in the world seemed to be watching him. The pilots beside him, the 62 passengers behind them, his wife back home, God himself looking down. What if he was wrong? What if this made everything worse? What if he was about to kill everyone because of arrogance, because he couldn't admit that farm equipment and aircraft were too different because... No, stop, trust the experience, trust the machinery. 3, 2, 1, now. Chen hit the pump. Webb threw the aileron controls left. Tom's eyes locked on the gauges. System 1 pressure, 15 psi, holding. Cycle ailerons, Tom called. Webb reversed the controls. The pressure gauge flickered, dropped to 10, Tom's stomach lurched. Then jumped to 25. Again, Tom's voice was electric, keep cycling. Chen pulsed the pump. Webb worked the controls like a man possessed. The cockpit filled with mechanical sounds, pumps whining, valves clicking, the airframe groaning under the unusual inputs. 6,800 feet. The pressure gauge on System 1 wavered, dancing between 25 and 30 psi. Not much. Not nearly enough for full control, but it was rising. For the first time since the crisis began, the numbers were going up instead of down. "It's working," Webb's voice cracked with something that might have been hope. "System 1 is gaining pressure." "Don't stop," Tom commanded. "Keep the rhythm. Sarah, when I say, switch to System 2 and cycle the elevator controls instead." Sweat poured down Chen's face. Her hands were cramping from gripping the pump control, but she kept cycling. 3 on, 2 off, 3 on, 2 off. System 1 hit 40 psi, 45, 50. "Now switch to System 2, Tom shouted. Chen's muscle memory took over, years of training translating Tom's instructions into action. Her hands flew across the controls, engaging System 2's circuit. Webb grabbed the elevator controls, pushing forward and pulling back in steady rhythm. The plane lurched, passengers screamed. In the cabin, Jennifer Costa gripped her jump seat, praying harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Tom watched System 2's gauge. It flickered, dropped. His heart stopped. Then surged upward, 20 psi, 35, 50, 60. "Yes," Webb shouted, "we're getting pressure." But they weren't done. System 3 still showed only 75 psi, better than the others but dropping slowly. And they were at 6,200 feet, the ground rushing up with terrible speed. "System 3, Tom called. Rudder controls, move them." The procedure continued, a desperate mechanical dance choreographed by a Nebraska farmer who was either a genius or a madman, possibly both. 5,800 feet. System 1, 60 psi. System 2, 70 psi. System 3, climbing past 80, 9,100 psi. Captain Sarah Chen pulled back gently on the control yoke and felt resistance, real, beautiful, mechanical resistance. The nose lifted. Their descent rate decreased from 900 feet per minute to 600. "Oh my God," Chen whispered. "Oh my God, it's working." Tom Mitchell, farmer, father, dreamer, allowed himself the smallest smile. "Told you," he said softly. "Machines speak the same language, whether they're in a field or in the sky." But they weren't safe yet. Not even close. The cockpit instruments told a story that should have been impossible. System 1, 65 psi and holding. System 2, 75 psi and climbing. System 3, 110 psi, almost normal operating pressure. The hydraulic systems that had been dying 5 minutes ago were coming back to life, responding to a repair technique that had never been attempted at 12,000 feet, performed by a man who'd never set foot in a cockpit before today. Captain Sarah Chen's hands trembled on the control yoke as she felt something she'd thought was gone forever: control. Real, tangible, mechanical control. When she pulled back, the nose actually rose. When she banked left, the aircraft actually turned. The responses were sluggish, mushy, nowhere near normal, but they existed. "I can fly her," Chen breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "Marcus, I can actually fly her." First Officer Marcus Webb stared at his instruments like a man witnessing a resurrection. Pressures stabilizing across all 3 systems. "It's not perfect. We're running at maybe 60% capacity, but it's there. It's actually there." Tom Mitchell leaned against the cockpit wall, his legs suddenly weak as adrenaline drained from his system. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands shaking from the tension of the last 10 minutes. He'd just performed emergency surgery on a flying machine using nothing but knowledge from farm equipment, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. But the celebrations were premature. "We're at 5,000 feet, Webb reported, his brief elation fading. "Still descending. We need to arrest this descent and gain altitude." Chen pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, their power finally translating into actual climb performance now that the flight controls were responding. The vertical speed indicator slowly, agonizingly, began to show a decrease in their descent rate. 800 feet per minute down. And then, miracle of miracles, The needle crossed zero and entered positive territory. "We're climbing," Chen announced, and now tears were streaming freely down her face. "We're actually climbing." The radio crackled to life. "United 3411, Chicago Center. We're showing a change in your descent profile. What's your status?" Webb grabbed the microphone, his voice shaking with emotion he didn't bother to hide. "Chicago Center, United 3411 has. We've regained partial hydraulic control. Say again, we have regained partial flight control capability." There was a pause on the other end. When the controller spoke again, his professional composure had cracked. 3411, can you confirm? You've restored hydraulic pressure." "Affirmative, we're at approximately 60% capacity across all three systems. We can control the aircraft." Webb looked at Tom. "Thanks to unconventional assistance." 3411, that's incredible. What's your intention?" Chen and Webb exchanged glances. They had control, but it was fragile, limited. They couldn't risk a long flight back to O'Hare. They needed to land soon while the pressure held. "We're proceeding to Rockford International," Chen decided. "Closest suitable airport. We'll need emergency equipment standing by." "Roger 3411, Rockford is expecting you. Runway 19 is clear, emergency services in position." But Tom's farmer instincts, the same instincts that had saved them once, were screaming warnings. He was watching the hydraulic pressure gauges with the intensity of a man watching storm clouds approach his unharvested wheat. "Captain," he said quietly, "look at System 2. Chen's eyes snapped to the gauge. It read 70 psi. As she watched, it flickered to 68, then 65. "It's dropping again," she said, ice returning to her veins. "The airlocks are partially cleared but not completely," Tom explained, his mind racing through the mechanics. "We bought you control, but it's not stable. The remaining air pockets are still compressing under pressure, still blocking full fluid flow. It's like," he searched for a comparison they'd understand, "like a clogged artery that you've partially opened. Blood flows but not perfectly, and the blockage can get worse again." Webb pulled up the navigation display. "Rockford is 18 miles out. At our current speed, that's about 6 minutes." "Will the pressure hold for 6 minutes?" Chen asked Tom directly. Tom studied the gauges. System 1 had dropped from 65 to 60. System 3 was holding at 110 but showing slight fluctuations. His experience with temperamental farm equipment was screaming that this was a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. The air in the system would continue causing problems until they could properly bleed and purge the entire hydraulic circuit, something that required the aircraft to be on the ground with external pumps. "I don't know," Tom admitted. Maybe not, but you're losing pressure slowly, not rapidly. That's a good sign." "We need to land as fast as possible," Chen decided. "Marcus, calculate our approach to Rockford. Straight in, no pattern, no delays. I want wheels on the ground in 5 minutes or less." "On it." Webb's fingers flew across his navigation computer. Chen keyed the intercom to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Chen. You may have noticed our situation has improved. We've regained control of the aircraft and are proceeding to Rockford International Airport for an emergency landing. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened and follow all instructions from the flight attendants." In the cabin, the announcement was met with a mixture of tears, prayers, and cautious cheering. People who'd been certain they were about to die were suddenly facing the possibility of survival. Jennifer Costa moved through the aisles with renewed purpose, checking seatbelts, securing loose items, preparing for what would still be a very dangerous landing. The elderly couple in row 12 held hands tighter. The businessman in 7C closed his laptop and tucked it away, his hands still shaking. The college student with purple hair wiped tears from her face. The mother clutched her baby, whispering thanks to a God she'd stopped believing in years ago. And in seat 14B, the young woman who'd sat next to Tom looked at his empty seat with newfound understanding. That strange, calm farmer who'd unbuckled and walked toward the cockpit during their death spiral. He'd saved them all. In the cockpit, Tom remained standing behind the pilots, unwilling to leave until the plane was safely on the ground. He watched the pressure gauges like a hawk, calling out any changes. System 1 at 58 psi, holding. System 2 at 63, slight drop but stable. System 3 at 105, still good. Chen flew the aircraft with extreme delicacy, making only the gentlest control inputs. Every movement of the yoke, every slight bank or pitch change, consumed precious hydraulic pressure. She was flying like a student pilot on their first solo, overcautious, deliberate, treating the aircraft like it might shatter at any moment. Because it might. Rockford in sight, Webb announced. Through the windscreen, they could see the airport, 2 runways forming a cross, emergency vehicles with flashing lights arranged along the sides, news helicopters hovering at a safe distance. The world was watching. The story had already gone viral, social media exploding with posts about the United flight with total hydraulic failure, the miracle recovery, the mysterious passenger who'd entered the cockpit. News networks had interrupted regular programming. The FAA administrator was on a phone call with the airline CEO. Aviation experts on TV were calling it impossible. But Tom Mitchell knew the truth that he'd learned over 37 years of farming. Impossible just meant nobody had tried the right solution yet. Beginning approach, Chen announced. Flaps. Webb checked. We have partial flap control. I can give you flaps 10, maybe 15, not the full 30 we'd normally use. Do it carefully. Webb extended the flaps incrementally. The plane shuddered. System 2 pressure dropped to 55 psi. That's all we can afford, Chen said. We'll be coming in faster than normal, but we don't have a choice. The landing gear was the next test. Without hydraulics, the gear might not extend, or it might extend but not lock. Either scenario would be catastrophic. Gear down, Chen ordered. Webb pulled the gear lever. For 5 eternal seconds, nothing happened. Then 3 solid thunks as the landing gear extended and locked into place. The indicator lights showed green. Gear down and locked, Webb shouted. We have gear. Tom felt tears sting his eyes. They were going to make it. Against every odd, against all logic, they were actually going to make it. But hydraulic system, 1 just dropped to 50 psi. And they were still 2 miles from the runway. 2 miles had never seemed so far. Captain Sarah Chen lined up United Express Flight 3411 with runway 19 at Rockford International, her eyes darting between the windscreen and the instrument panel. The runway stretched before them like a gray ribbon of salvation, so close, yet impossibly distant. System 1 at 45 psi, Tom Mitchell called out from behind the pilots, his voice tight with concern. System 2 at 50, both dropping. Chen's hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. She could feel the aircraft's responses getting mushier, slower, like steering through mud that was gradually hardening to concrete. Every control input now came with a half-second delay, and she had to anticipate the aircraft's behavior rather than react to it. Airspeed 140 knots, First Officer Marcus Webb reported. We're 30 knots faster than normal approach speed. Can't slow down more, Chen replied through gritted teeth. We need the speed for control authority. We'll eat up runway, but we don't have a choice. Below them, Rockford International had transformed into a scene from a disaster movie. Every emergency vehicle in 3 counties lined the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment, their lights painting the late afternoon in strobing red and blue. News helicopters maintained their distance, cameras broadcasting every second to a watching world. In the terminal, airport personnel and passengers pressed against windows, phones recording, prayers whispered. In the cockpit, Tom watched the hydraulic pressure gauges with the sick feeling of a farmer watching storm clouds devour his crops. The numbers were bleeding away slowly but steadily. System 1, 40 psi. System 2, 48 psi. System 3 was holding better at 95 psi, but even it showed a downward trend. 1 mile out, Webb announced. Sink rate 500 feet per minute. The ground rushed up to meet them. Chen could see individual vehicles now, could make out faces of emergency personnel watching their approach. The airport was surrounded by farmland, endless fields that looked heartbreakingly similar to Tom's Nebraska home. If they didn't make the runway, they'd cartwheel through someone's corn crop. System 1 at 35, Tom called, his voice cracking. Captain, you're losing aileron control. Chen felt it. When she banked to correct their alignment, the wings responded like they were moving through honey. The aircraft wallowed, sluggish and heavy. Half mile, Webb said. We're high and fast. They were coming in too steep, too quick. Normally, Chen would add flaps to increase drag and steepen the descent. But the flaps were already at their maximum safe deployment with the compromised hydraulics. Any more and they might lose what little control remained. I need to dive for the runway, Chen decided. She pushed the yoke forward. The nose dropped. The runway filled the windscreen. Passengers in the cabin screamed as the ground seemed to leap toward them. 400 feet, 300, Webb's voice climbed with each callout. Sink rate 800 feet per minute, that's too fast, Sarah. I know. Chen hauled back on the yoke, trying to arrest their descent, trying to flare the aircraft into a proper landing attitude. The controls barely responded. System 2 at 40, Tom shouted. System 1 at 30. They were running out of hydraulic fluid, running out of pressure, running out of time. The physics were brutal and unforgiving. Without hydraulic pressure, the flight control surfaces wouldn't move. Without control surfaces, the aircraft was just a metal tube falling from the sky. 200 feet, Webb called. Chen's years of training, her thousands of hours in the cockpit, her combat experience in Afghanistan, all of it crystallized into this single moment. She couldn't think about her daughter, couldn't think about the 64 souls depending on her, could only think about feel, about instinct, about coaxing this dying machine to do what it no longer wanted to do. 100 feet. The runway threshold flashed beneath them. They were over pavement now, no turning back, no second chances. 50 feet. Chen pulled back on the yoke with every ounce of strength in her arms. The nose lifted, barely. The main landing gear was coming down too fast, too hard. They were going to hit like a meteor. System 1 at 25. Tom's voice was a prayer. 30 feet. In the cabin, passengers assumed crash positions. Jennifer Costa gripped her jumpseat, eyes squeezed shut. The elderly couple held each other. The businessman thought of his wife. The mother covered her baby's head with her hands. 20 feet. The stall warning horn blared. They were too slow, too nose-high, the aircraft on the edge of falling out of the sky. But the ground was right there, right there. 10 feet. Contact. The main landing gear slammed into the runway with a bone-jarring impact that sent a shockwave through the entire aircraft. Metal shrieked. Passengers screamed. The force was so violent that overhead bins popped open. Loose items flew through the cabin. Oxygen masks swung wildly on their tethers. But the gear held. Thrust reverse, maximum braking, Chen screamed. Webb slammed the thrust reversers into position. The engines roared, their power now directed forward, fighting to slow the aircraft. Chen stood on the brake pedals with all her weight. The aircraft screamed down the runway at 140 knots, 161 miles per hour. The anti-skid braking system, compromised by the hydraulic failure, stuttered and fought. The tires smoked, leaving black rubber trails on the concrete. System 1 at 15 psi, Tom called. You're losing brake pressure. The runway was 6,500 feet long. At their current speed and braking rate, they'd need every inch. Chen felt the brakes fatting, the pedals getting softer, mushier. The hydraulic pressure that operated the braking system was bleeding away with every second. 100 knots, Webb shouted, watching their speed. We need to slow more. There's only 3,000 feet of runway left. The end of the runway was visible now, marked by EMAS, Engineered Materials Arresting System, a bed of crushable concrete designed to stop aircraft that overrun. Beyond that was a fence, a road, and open farmland. Come on, come on, come on, Chen growled at the aircraft, at physics itself. 90 knots. 2,000 feet of runway remaining. The brakes were barely working now, the hydraulic pressure almost gone. They were still traveling at over 100 miles per hour with less than half a mile to stop. 80 knots. 1,500 feet remaining. Tom Mitchell, standing in the cockpit, thought of his wife Martha back in Nebraska, thought of his daughter Rebecca and his grandson, thought of how strange it was that he'd survive falling from the sky only to die sliding off a runway. 70 knots. 1,000 feet. The emergency vehicles alongside the runway tracked their progress, ready to respond if they crashed through the fence and exploded in a fireball. 60 knots. 500 feet. Chen could see the individual blocks of the EMAS system. They were going to hit it. Even at 60 knots, nearly 70 miles per hour, slamming into the arrestor bed would be catastrophic. Brace, 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 she screamed into the intercom. 50 knots. 300 feet. The aircraft was barely slowing. The brakes were dead. Only the thrust reversers and aerodynamic drag were working. 40 knots. 150 feet. Tom closed his eyes. Chen pulled the emergency brake handle, a last-ditch mechanical backup that bypassed the hydraulics entirely. The aircraft shuddered, jolted. The nose dipped as the remaining braking force bit into the runway. 30 knots. 75 feet. The nose wheel was 20 feet from the EMAS bed. 25 knots. 50 feet. 20 feet from disaster. 20 knots. 25 feet. Slowing. 15 knots. 10 feet. The nose wheel rolled to within 6 feet of the EMAS system, close enough that Chen could read the warning markings painted on it. And stopped. The aircraft sat motionless on the runway, its engines spooling down to silence. Smoke poured from the overheated brakes and tortured tires. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. For 3 full seconds, the cockpit was absolutely silent. Then Webb whispered, "We're down, we're actually down." Chen's hands wouldn't release the yoke. Her entire body was shaking, adrenaline crashing through her system like a tidal wave. Tom Mitchell slid down the cockpit wall into a sitting position, his legs finally giving out completely. And in the cabin, the silence broke with an eruption of sound, crying, screaming, cheering, praying. 64 people who'd been seconds from death, now safely on the ground. They'd survived. Against impossible odds, against failed systems, against death itself, they'd survived. The emergency vehicles swarmed United Express Flight 3411 before the engines had fully spooled down. Fire trucks surrounded the aircraft like protective sentinels, foam cannon operators ready for any sign of fire. Paramedics rushed stairs to the cabin doors. Airport security established a perimeter. News helicopters descended lower, their cameras capturing every second of what would become the most replayed aviation footage of the decade. Inside the cockpit, Captain Sarah Chen finally released her death grip on the control yoke. Her hands were cramping, fingers locked in position. First Officer Marcus Webb sat motionless, staring at instruments that showed impossible readings. System 1, 10 psi. System 2, 20 psi. System 3, 65 psi. They'd landed on vapors, on prayers, on hydraulic pressure that shouldn't have existed. Tom Mitchell remained slumped against the cockpit wall, his flannel shirt soaked with sweat, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He just participated in something that would be studied in aviation schools for generations. A Nebraska corn farmer who'd saved a commercial aircraft using knowledge from John Deere tractors. The cabin door opened. Jennifer Costa stood there, tears streaming down her face, her professional composure completely shattered. Behind her, passengers were crying, hugging, kissing the ground as they evacuated down the emergency slides. The mother with the baby was sobbing uncontrollably. The elderly couple held each other. 53 years of marriage nearly ended at 12,000 feet. The businessman was on his phone, his voice breaking as he told his wife he loved her. Chen turned in her seat to face Tom. Her eyes were red, her face pale with exhaustion. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice raw with emotion, "you saved 64 lives today." Tom shook his head slowly. "We saved them, Captain, all three of us. I just knew machines." Webb extended his hand, his earlier skepticism completely evaporated. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I called you." "Don't," Tom gripped the young pilot's hand firmly. "You were right to doubt. What we did was insane. It shouldn't have worked." He smiled weakly. "But thank God it did." Emergency personnel appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Captain, we need to evacuate the crew. There's still fuel on board and those brakes are white hot." The three of them, 2 pilots and a farmer, emerged from the aircraft to a scene of controlled chaos. Passengers were being triaged by paramedics, though miraculously, no one appeared seriously injured. News crews had breached the airport perimeter, cameras recording, reporters shouting questions. FAA investigators were already on scene, black boxes being secured, witness statements being taken. And then someone recognized Tom. "That's him. That's the passenger who went into the cockpit." A reporter thrust a microphone in his face. Sir, is it true you're a farmer? Is it true you fixed the aircraft with farming knowledge?" Tom blinked in the camera lights, completely overwhelmed. I just did what anyone would." "Mr. Mitchell," another reporter pushed forward, "CNN is reporting you saved everyone on board. How does it feel to be a hero?" Hero? The word felt wrong. Tom had spent his entire life being invisible, just another farmer in flyover country, someone city folks never thought about except when their food prices went up. Now cameras were everywhere, microphones thrust at him, the entire world wanting his story. "I'm not a hero," Tom said quietly, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Airport security intervened, escorting Tom, Chen, and Webb to a private room while the scene outside continued to explode. Within an hour, Tom Mitchell's name was trending worldwide on social media. Videos of the landing were being analyzed frame by frame. Aviation experts appeared on every news channel, struggling to explain how a complete hydraulic failure had been overcome mid-flight. The investigation that followed would take 3 months and involve the FAA, NTSB, the aircraft manufacturer, and dozens of engineers. What they discovered made headlines of its own: a manufacturing defect in a batch of hydraulic line fittings. A microscopic crack in the metal had allowed all 3 systems to slowly contaminate each other during rapid pressure changes at altitude. Air had been sucked into the lines through the cracks, creating the air locks that Tom had recognized. The defect affected 17 aircraft across 4 airlines. Because of Tom's quick thinking and the investigation that followed, every one of those aircraft was grounded and repaired before another catastrophic failure could occur. Engineers estimated Tom Mitchell had potentially saved hundreds of lives beyond the 64 on his flight. The honors came quickly. The governor of Nebraska presented Tom with the state's highest civilian medal. The FAA gave him an unprecedented commendation for extraordinary contribution to aviation safety. He appeared on 60 Minutes, The Today Show, and Good Morning America. A book deal was offered. A movie studio optioned his life rights. Captain Sarah Chen testified before Congress about the incident, crediting Tom's unconventional thinking with saving her crew and passengers. She became an advocate for incorporating diverse mechanical knowledge into pilot training programs. Marcus Webb gave interviews about the importance of keeping an open mind during emergencies. But 3 months after the incident, on a cold January morning, Tom Mitchell was exactly where he wanted to be. Standing in his Nebraska cornfield, mud on his boots, frost on the stubble, checking his equipment for the spring planting. His wife Martha brought him coffee in a thermos, bundled in her winter coat. "News truck just called again," she said. "Wanted to do a follow-up story for the anniversary." Tom smiled, sipping the coffee. "What'd you tell them?" "That you were busy, like always." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over land that had been in Tom's family for 4 generations, the same land he'd almost never seen again. "You ever regret not taking that book deal?" Martha asked. "The movie deal, they offered a lot of money." Tom wrapped an arm around his wife. "This is enough. The farm, you, the kids, knowing those 64 people got to go home to their families." He paused. "Besides, I got something better than money." "What's that?" "I finally enrolled in flight school. Really enrolled. Started classes last week." Martha's eyes widened. "Tom Mitchell, you're 58 years old." "And I've wanted to fly since I was 7. Figured if I can save a plane, I ought to learn to actually pilot one properly." She laughed, the sound carrying across the frozen field. "You're impossible." "I'm a farmer," Tom corrected with a grin. "We're all impossible. How else would we convince seeds to grow in dirt?" 6 months later, Tom Mitchell earned his private pilot's license. He bought a used Cessna 172 and named it Second Chance. On weekends, he'd fly over his farm, seeing the land from the perspective he'd dreamed of his entire life. And sometimes, at night, he'd stand in his field and watch the contrails of commercial aircraft crossing the Nebraska sky, knowing that up there, in those metal tubes, were people living their ordinary lives, trusting that machines and the humans who understood them would keep them safe. Tom Mitchell had learned something that October day at 12,000 feet. Expertise doesn't come with fancy degrees or expensive offices. It comes from decades of patient work, from listening to machines, from the willingness to trust your knowledge even when the world doubts you. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work boots and flannel shirts. Sometimes they smell like diesel fuel and know the rhythm of hydraulic pumps. Sometimes they're farmers from Nebraska who understand that whether you're in a wheat field or falling from the sky, the principles are the same. Stay calm, trust your experience, and remember that every machine, no matter how complex, speaks a language that can be learned. Tom looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky and smiled. Somewhere up there, people were flying home. And that was enough. The end.